The market square at Hollowmere Cross filled slowly on the first Thursday of October, stalls unfolding their canvas roofs against a sky the color of pewter. And it was there, between the chandler's cart and the baker's table, that the whispering began again. Eleanor Vane felt it before she heard it. A pause in the chatter to her left, a woman's sleeve drawn close against her friend's. The particular hush that meant her name, or something near enough to it, had just been spoken. Her morning gown was 6 weeks old and already familiar on her body in the way grief becomes familiar, a weight she no longer noticed until she moved wrong, and it reminded her it was there. Black wool, plain collar, no ornament. She had chosen it herself from the modest bolt at the draper's, and she had not imagined, choosing it, that its color would come to mean anything beyond what it was meant to mean. "There she goes," murmured a voice behind the cheese stall, not troubling itself to be quiet. The Earl's mistress, in her mourning black, wore it a fortnight before his lordship ever took to his bed. Some say she knew. Eleanor did not turn. She had learned, in 6 weeks, precisely how much a person could absorb without breaking stride. She knew what the words meant to imply, and knew, with the particular clarity of someone who had done nothing wrong, exactly how little truth lived inside them. She had worn black because her father was dead. The Earl of Hollowmere's fever had come more than a fortnight after that, an unrelated catastrophe arriving late to a house already grieving, and the county had taken the accident of timing and turned it into a story it liked better than the truth. The carriage came around the corner of the church lane before she reached the chemist's door, black lacquer dulled with travel dust, the Hollowmere crest half obscured by mud thrown up from the Exeter road. She had not known he meant to come as far as the village. No one had told her he was well enough. The carriage slowed rather than stopped, and through the lowered glass she saw him for the first time in 6 weeks. The Earl of Hollowmere, sitting too still against the seat cushion the way a man sits, when sitting upright still costs him something. His face had thinned in his illness until the bones of it showed plainly, and his eyes, when they found her across the square, did not move away again. He did not incline his head. He did not lift a gloved hand in greeting, which would have been proper and expected and entirely safe. He only looked at her. For the length of 3 full breaths, with an attention so undisguised that the woman behind the cheese stall stopped talking altogether. Then the carriage rolled on, and the square exhaled, and Eleanor stood with her father's old ledger book pressed flat against her ribs beneath her cloak, where it had ridden unseen and unmentioned for 6 weeks, and understood that whatever the county thought it knew about her, it did not yet know the half of what was true. She did not know, standing there in the thin October light, that the man in the carriage had spent the better part of his illness dreaming not of his own recovery, but of a woman in black, crossing a square he could not reach, and that somewhere beneath the fever's wreckage a single fact had lodged itself, and would not be dislodged again. That he had noticed her before he had any right to. That noticing, once it began, did not observe the county's opinion of who deserved it. Eleanor Vane was 24 years old, and until 6 weeks before, she had been the steward's daughter of Hollowmere, a position with no title and no wages of its own, which suited a life spent mostly in her father's shadow, copying his figures into a second hand so his eyes might rest, walking the tenant lanes at his side while he named each family and each debt and each small mercy the estate owed to people, the ledgers reduced to numbers. Edmund Vane had managed Hollowmere's accounts for 11 years under 2 earls, the present one's father, and now, briefly and badly, the present one himself, who had been absent from the estate almost entirely since his wife's death 3 years before, running Hollowmere by letter from London the way a man runs a house he cannot bear to enter. Eleanor remembered her father at that same kitchen table on ordinary evenings, spectacles pushed low on his nose, reading aloud each tenant's name as he entered it, teaching her without ever quite calling it. Teaching that a column of figures was, properly understood, a record of who in the parish needed watching over and who could, for now, be trusted to manage alone. She had thought, as a girl, that this was simply what fathers did. She understood now that it had been a kind of inheritance, handed to her in installments so gradual she had not noticed receiving it until there was nothing left of him to hand it further. When Edmund's cough had worsened past pretending, in August, there had been no steward's replacement summoned, no notice sent up to town that mattered enough to interrupt whatever kept the Earl away. Eleanor had simply continued the work herself, quietly, at her father's kitchen table, because the harvest accounts did not care that the man who usually kept them was dying by inches in the next room. She had sat with him in the evenings and worked by the same candle, reading him each entry aloud so that he might correct her if his failing strength still allowed it. And toward the end, when it no longer did, she had simply gone on reading the entries into the quiet room, for her own comfort as much as his, until the evening he did not answer her at all. She had buried him on the last day of August. Reverend Whitcomb had spoken well of him, called him faithful and exact, and had not known, because Eleanor had told no one, that faithful and exact described the daughter now as much as the father, that the ledgers presented each quarter day to Hollowmere's absent Earl had been in her hand, in her arithmetic, in her judgment about which tenant's rent might wait another month, for the better part of a year. She had gone on wearing black because her father deserved a daughter who mourned him properly, and she had gone on keeping the books because someone had to, and if anyone at the manor house had noticed that the steward's work continued unbroken after the steward's death, no one had troubled to ask how. Mrs. Hartley noticed. The housekeeper at Hollowmere had known Eleanor since she was small enough to be handed up onto the pony cart, and it was Mrs. Hartley who found her a standing arrangement to deliver the quarter accounts to the manor herself, rather than trust them to a footman, on the thin pretense that the new steward, whoever he proved to be, would want the figures explained by someone who understood them. "You cannot keep this house on pretense forever, my girl," Mrs. Hartley told her one October morning, setting a cup of tea at Eleanor's elbow in the kitchen passage where the estate's business was, by long custom, conducted out of the family's sight. "Sooner or later, somebody in that drawing room will ask who has truly been minding the money since your father died, and pretense will not answer for you. Then I will tell them the truth when they ask," Eleanor said, "and not before. I have no wish to be thanked. I have a wish to be useful, and to be left alone to be it." She did not say the other truth, which was that being useful and unremarked was the only shape of belonging left to her at Hollowmere, now that her father's cottage would pass, within the year, to whatever steward the estate finally appointed, and that a woman with no name of her own, and no fortune, and no station, had learned, from a young age, that visibility was a luxury the world extended to women it had already decided to want. The dismissive murmur in the market square was not, she told herself, walking home along the lane with the ledger still pressed to her side, a wound so very different from the ones she had already carried. It only had a crueler shape. It called her something she was not, instead of simply failing to call her anything at all. The Earl's return to Hollowmere in person came 3 days after the market square, and it came, as everything about him seemed to that autumn, without warning issued to the household that would have to receive him. Julian Ashworth arrived in the late afternoon on horseback, rather than by carriage. Against every physician's instruction and against, Eleanor gathered from the flurry in the kitchen passage his aunt's express written protest, and he came directly to the estate office rather than to his own rooms, which was where Eleanor happened to be standing with the quarter ledger open on the desk when the door opened without a knock. She had not expected to see him again so soon, and certainly not alone, and certainly not in the small paneled room that still smelled faintly of her father's pipe tobacco, though he had been dead 2 months. Miss Vane. He said her name correctly, which surprised her, and stood a moment inside the doorway as though the room itself required his permission to enter it. Which perhaps she thought it did, since he had not set foot in it in 3 years. I am told the accounts have been kept. They have, my lord. She closed the ledger with more composure than she felt. I did not think it my place to send them up to town unexplained. I hoped someone might come and ask after them properly, in time. I have come now. He crossed to the desk, slowly, the way a man crosses a room whose floor he no longer entirely trusts, and looked down at the closed book rather than at her. Show me. She showed him. It took the better part of an hour, the tenant rents reconciled against the harvest returns, the flooded acreage at Marsh Bottom written off against the year's yield, the small debts forgiven, and the reasons for forgiving them noted in her father's old hand until August, and in her own after it, and Julian Ashworth stood at her shoulder and read every line without once suggesting she summarize instead, which no one in 11 years had ever troubled to do for her father either. Your father managed this well, he said at last. My father is dead, my lord. I have managed it since August. He looked at her then, properly, for the first time since the carriage window, and something crossed his face that was not quite surprise, and was not quite anything she had a name for. A stillness held a fraction too long before it resolved itself into nothing at all. Then Hollowmere is more fortunate than it deserves, he said, and I am more remiss than I care to admit. Sit down, Miss Vane. You have been standing an hour, and I have not thought to offer you a chair, which is precisely the kind of oversight my aunt will tell you is typical of me. I am quite well standing, my lord. Sit down, he said again, not unkindly, but in the flat, unhurried register of a man who did not often repeat himself, and did not expect to need to. It was not, she understood even as she obeyed it, a command born of anything so simple as courtesy. It sat oddly close, in his voice, to concern, though concern for a steward's daughter he had known perhaps 4 minutes together was a strange thing for an earl to feel, and a stranger thing still for him to let show. She sat. He did not, choosing instead to stand at the cold hearth with one hand braced against the mantel, as though his legs, 3 weeks out of a sickbed, required the help, and would not admit to it. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, and the silence held the particular charge of 2 people newly aware of being alone in a room together, and both determined not to say so. The village believes a great many things about you, Miss Vane, he said finally, to the empty grate rather than to her. I heard some version of it before I was a week out of bed. My valet is not a discreet man. Her spine went straight. I have not asked what the village believes. No, I imagine you have not needed to. He turned then, and his eyes were the gray of a sea under weather, not cold so much as guarded, a man keeping careful watch over a coastline he expected trouble from. I will not repeat it in this room. I only wished you to know that I have heard it, and that I do not credit it, and that a man in my position saying so aloud changes rather less than either of us would like. It was, she thought later, walking back to her father's cottage in the blue dusk, the nearest thing to a kindness anyone at the manor house had offered her since August, and it unsettled her more than the market square gossip had, because gossip she knew how to endure. She had no practiced answer for a stillness in a gray-eyed man that felt, however briefly, like being seen. If you have ever kept a house running on work no one thought to credit you for, you will know already how strange it feels the first time someone notices. Stay with Eleanor a while longer. The county was not finished with her yet, and neither, though she did not know it, was the man at the mantel. The witnessing came 11 days later, on an evening Eleanor had not meant anyone to observe at all. Old Sarah Combe, who kept the gatehouse cottage at the eastern boundary with her widowed daughter and 4 grandchildren, had taken a fever in the wet weeks after the flooding, and her rent for Michaelmas quarter sat unpaid in the ledger beside a note in Eleanor's own hand that read, simply, "Wait." It was the kind of decision her father had trusted her to make, and no one at the manor had yet thought to question, and it was not, strictly, a decision that cost Eleanor anything at all, until the evening she carried a covered basket down the eastern lane herself, unpaid, unasked, because Sarah Combe's fever had turned, and there was no one else free to sit with a sick old woman while her daughter walked 3 miles for the surgeon. The cottage was small and close, and smelled of tallow, and the particular sourness of a sick room kept too long shut against the damp, and Eleanor had propped the shutter open a hand's width, despite the cold, because Sarah's daughter swore the old woman breathed easier for a little air, and it was through that narrow gap that the last gray light of the evening reached the bed where Eleanor sat. She did not know the Earl had ridden that lane that evening on his way back from the flooded acreage until she looked up from the low stool beside Sarah's bed and found him standing in the open cottage doorway, hat in hand, plainly having stopped his horse and dismounted and come no further than he needed to see what he was interrupting. She had been reading aloud. It was foolish, she thought afterward, coloring at the memory of it, to have been caught doing something so unguarded. But Sarah Combe liked the Psalms read slow in the fever heat, and Eleanor had brought her father's worn prayer book from habit, and she had been perhaps 4 verses into the 90th Psalm, her voice pitched low and even, one hand resting on the old woman's wrist to count the fever's pulse against the meter of her own reading when she became aware of the Earl's stillness in the doorway, and stopped. "Forgive the interruption," he said, low, and did not come further in. "I did not mean to be seen. You are not interrupting anything I am ashamed of, my lord." She rose, smoothing her skirts. "Sarah's rent has gone unpaid a quarter. I did not think it my place to forgive it out of the estate's purse without your leave, so I have been paying the physician's man myself out of my own wages until I can put the matter to you properly." Something moved through his face, quick and unguarded before he mastered it. The same stillness she had seen at the mantel 3 weeks before, but deeper now. Less careful. "Out of your own wages." "I have very few other uses for them, my lord." He said nothing further about it that evening, only stood in the doorway a moment longer, watching her settle Sarah's blanket, and then he was gone, back into the wet dark toward the manor, and Eleanor thought no more of it until, 2 days later, she found Sarah Combe's rent, marked paid in full, in a hand that was not her own, with no note attached and no acknowledgement sought. She understood, reading it, that she had been watched doing a small ordinary thing she had never expected credit for, and that the watching had changed something in the watcher that he had not troubled to explain, and she had not the standing to ask him to. 3 days later, a hard rain caught her on the lane back from Marsh Bottom, and she had not gone far past the estate office when the Earl's own carriage overtook her, slowing without being asked, the door swinging open before the wheels had fully stopped. "Get in," he said. And when she hesitated, weighing what the coachman might think and what the village might say if it were seen, he said it again, quieter, with none of the rank behind it, and all of the plain fact. "You are soaked through, Miss Vane, and Marsh Bottom is 2 miles yet from your father's cottage. Get in, and argue with me about it once you are dry." She got in. He did not speak again until they reached her door, save to press a folded blanket from the seat into her hands and tell her, in the same flat, unhurried voice, to eat something warm before she caught the very chill that had so nearly undone him. And she carried the shape of that small, ordinary kindness with her longer than she carried the memory of the rain itself. The dowager's tea the following week was not, on its surface, any different from a dozen such afternoons Lady Ashworth had presided over since her nephew's wife died and left the running of Hollowmere's small society to his aunt by marriage. Miss Camilla Redcliffe sat at Lady Ashworth's right hand in sprigged muslin the color of a robin's egg, laughing at something Mr. Reginald Ashworth had said, and Eleanor, summoned to bring the revised harvest figures because the Earl had asked for them before supper, stood at the edge of the drawing-room in her morning black, feeling every inch the intrusion the room had decided she was. "Miss Vane!" Lady Ashworth's voice carried the particular music of a woman who had perfected, over 40 years, the art of wounding within the strict bounds of civility. "How industrious you have been! Quite running Hollowmere's business from the kitchen passage. One begins to wonder whether the county's talk is entirely without foundation. The Earl's mistress of the accounts, if nothing else." The room's laughter was small and immediate, and entirely at Eleanor's expense, and Camilla's eyes found hers over the rim of a teacup, with an interest that was not unkind, but was, unmistakably, assessing a rival she had not previously thought worth the trouble. Eleanor set the figures on the side table without comment, curtsied precisely as far as the moment required, and no further, and left the room before her face could betray her. And it was only in the corridor, her back against the cool paneling, that she allowed herself the single unsteady breath she had been holding since the dowager's teacup first rose to her lips. She did not see, because she had already gone, the way the Earl's jaw set when he entered a moment later, and heard the tail end of what his aunt had said, repeated to him, laughing by Reginald, or the particular quiet with which he asked his aunt never to speak so of Miss Vane in his hearing again. His fever returned that same week, a relapse the physician blamed on the flooded acreage and the wet October air, and 3 weeks of a man doing more than his body was yet fit for. And it was in the second night of it, when the household slept, and only Mrs. Hartley kept the sick-room candle burning low, that Eleanor came, as she had begun quietly coming each night since his relapse, to sit an hour in the chair by his door so Mrs. Hartley might rest her own eyes, and heard him speak a name that was not hers into the dark. "Margaret," he said, thick with fever, his hand moving on the coverlet as though reaching for something it could not find. "I was 3 hours away. 3 hours. And they did not send for me until it was already too late to matter." Eleanor sat very still. She had heard the name once before, from Mrs. Hartley. In the careful voice servants use for grief they were not permitted to have felt as deeply as they had. "I should have been here," he said, quieter now, the fever's grip loosening into something closer to sleep. "I told her London could wait. I did not think a birth could not." He did not wake fully, and in the morning he remembered nothing of having spoken, and Eleanor told no one what she had heard. But she understood, sitting in that chair through the small hours, that the coldness the county called his nature was not coldness at all. It was a man who had left his wife once. For 3 hours he could never buy back, and had spent 3 years since making certain he was never far enough from anyone in his charge to fail them twice. His commands, she saw now, sit down, eat something, come inside, were not the reflex of rank exercising itself. They were the only language a man like that had left for saying, "Stay where I can reach you." In the morning room, untouched since his wife's death, an embroidery hoop still sat in its stand by the window. the linen stretched taut across it, and the needle left through the last unfinished stitch of a garden border Margaret Ashworth had never lived to complete. Eleanor had passed that room a dozen times delivering household accounts, and had never once gone in. She understood now, without being told, exactly why no one else had either. If you have ever sat up through a fevered night beside someone who does not know you are there, you will understand what it does to a person to hear the truth of another's grief spoken to the dark and have nowhere honest to put it afterward. It changes the shape of what you owe them. It asks nothing back and gives everything away, which is very nearly the definition of the thing Eleanor was beginning, in the privacy of her own unspoken heart, to feel for the Earl of Hollowmere. Mr. Reginald Ashworth arrived at Hollowmere in the third week of November with a solicitor's letter and a tone of injured family duty that fooled no one who had watched him circle the estate's ledgers for the better part of a month. "It has come to my attention," he told the Earl in the estate office, with Eleanor present at the desk because the figures under discussion were hers to explain, "that the late steward's accounts for the summer quarter show certain irregularities, rents forgiven without written authority, sums unaccounted between the quarter days. I do not accuse Miss Vane of anything so crude as theft, cousin, only of a looseness with your money that a woman untrained to the work might be forgiven, and that Hollowmere, in its present unsteady state, can scarcely afford. The rents forgiven were Sarah Combs, on the eastern boundary, and 3 tenant families at Marsh Bottom whose land the flood ruined outright," Eleanor said, before the Earl could answer for her. "Every sum is noted, with the reason beside it, in my own hand, dated the day the decision was made. I have kept my father's practice exactly. If Mr. Pierce wishes to examine the books, I would welcome it. I have nothing in them I have not already shown his lordship myself. Mr. Pierce, sent for that same afternoon at the Earl's request, spent 3 hours over the ledgers, with his spectacles pushed to the top of his head and a single candle burned down to its dish, checking each disputed sum against the tenant registers and the parish poor rolls until there was nothing left to check, and pronounced them, by evening, the most exactly kept accounts he had examined in 20 years of estate practice. He said as much to the Earl directly in Eleanor's hearing, adding that he had rarely seen a hand so careful with another man's money as hers had been with Hollowmere's, and that any solicitor in the county would tell Mr. Ashworth the same were he willing to hear it from a stranger rather than a cousin. Reginald's borrowed outrage curdled visibly under the solicitor's report, though he recovered himself enough at supper that night to remark to the table at large that it was a curious thing, was it not, how thoroughly the Earl's mistress of the accounts had managed to clear her own name, and how conveniently his lordship's illness had placed him in a position to be grateful to her for it. The Earl was not present to hear it. He had gone up early, his relapse not yet fully spent, and it was Lady Ashworth, hearing the remark repeated to her the following morning by a housemaid who ought to have known better than to repeat it at all, who carried it to his sick room herself, dressed as concern. "The county says it openly now, Julian. Your mistress of the accounts, they call her, in the market square, at every tea table between here and Exeter. I do not say the girl has done wrong. I say the talk does Hollowmere harm regardless, and that you are not yet strong enough to weather the kind of scandal a steward's daughter kept too visibly near you will bring down on this house. He was 3 days from full health, and still fever-thinned enough that his aunt's argument found purchase where, a fortnight later, it would not have. And it was in that narrow window of weakness, with Eleanor absent at her father's cottage settling the last of his affairs, that Lady Ashworth acted, sending word to Eleanor by the housekeeper that her services at the manor were no longer required, and that a settlement of £20 awaited her collection at the estate office, in his lordship's name, should she wish to spare herself the indignity of asking for it in person. Eleanor did not ask for it in person. She read the note at her father's kitchen table in the last of the October light and felt something close, very quietly, that had been open in her since the market square. A small foolish hope she had not admitted to holding until she felt it extinguished. She had been useful. She had not, it seemed, been permitted to be anything more, and a woman who had spent her whole life learning the difference between the two did not waste grief arguing with the second when she had already made her peace with the first. She packed her father's ledgers into the trunk that had been his, left the manor's own books neatly reconciled on the estate office desk with no note attached, and walked, the next morning, the 3 miles to her aunt's cottage at Woodley, where she had been promised, if it ever came to it, a roof and a place at the mending table. The road to Woodley ran past the churchyard where her father lay, and she stopped there a moment, though the trunk was heavy, and her arms ached from carrying it unaided, because it seemed a poor sort of daughter who would pass her father's grave without a word on the last morning. She expected to see Hollowmere's spire at all. She did not weep. She had grown in 3 months, careful with her tears the way a woman grows careful with a coin she cannot be certain of replacing. And she spent instead a long, quiet minute simply standing where he lay and told him, in the plainest words she had, that she had kept his ledgers honest and his good name intact, and that whatever the county chose to call her now, it could not take that much away. Her aunt at Woodley was a kind, tired woman, with 6 children of her own already crowding the cottage, and she made room for a 7th without complaint. Though Eleanor lay awake that first night on a narrow pallet by the hearth, and understood, with a clarity that cost her more than the dismissal itself had, that she had traded a house where she had been useful for one where she would simply be fed, and that the second was not, whatever gratitude she owed her aunt for it, the same as belonging anywhere at all. The Earl of Hollowmere rose from his sickbed 4 days later to a house he did not recognize. His aunt's satisfaction at Eleanor's absence was worn too openly to hide, and it was Mrs. Hartley, summoned to his rooms under the pretense of household business, who finally told him, in a voice shaking with an anger she had held silent for 4 days, exactly what had been done in his name while he lay too weak to prevent it. £20, my lord, and a note sent by a housemaid, as though she were a servant dismissed for thieving the silver. She read it at her father's own table, Betsy tells me, and said not one word of complaint, only thanked the girl for carrying it, and asked her to walk safe home in the dark. That is the woman your aunt has called unfit to be spoken of in this house. He was on his feet before she finished, the physician's protests behind him meaning nothing at all, and it was in the estate office, staring at the ledgers Eleanor had left reconciled to the last farthing, with no claim staked to any of it, that the full shape of what his weakness had permitted finally settled on him. He thought of Margaret, 3 hours away, and of a fever that had loosened his tongue to a truth he had never spoken sober, and understood, with the particular clarity illness sometimes leaves behind it, that he had very nearly let the same failure happen twice, in a different shape, to a different woman, because he had once again let distance and other people's authority stand between himself and the one person in the house who had never once asked anything of him at all. "Saddle a horse," he told Reginald's own groom, because it was the nearest one to hand. And when the man hesitated, glancing toward the house for confirmation from someone with more standing to give it, the Earl said it again, quiet, final, in the voice that did not require a second asking. "Saddle it now." The village church at Hollowmere Cross held its harvest thanksgiving on the last Sunday of November, a modest gathering of tenants and townsfolk that Reverend Whitcomb had, this year, dedicated in part to the memory of Edmund Vane, whose faithful service to the parish accounts the church itself had relied upon for a decade of poor relief bookkeeping no one else had wanted. Eleanor had come only because her aunt insisted the invitation could not decently be refused, and she stood near the back of the nave in her mourning black, 3 months worn now and grown almost comfortable, listening to the Reverend speak her father's name with a steadiness she had not expected to hold on to her own composure so well through. She did not hear the door at the rear of the church until the congregation's murmur told her something had shifted, and she turned, with everyone else, to see the Earl of Hollowmere standing in the doorway in traveling dress, hatless, his color still not fully returned, having ridden the 3 miles from the manor without a groom in attendance. And without, it was plain from the state of him, stopping to consider whether a gentleman ought to arrive at Sunday service in such a condition at all. He walked the length of the nave. It took him perhaps 15 seconds, and every soul in the church watched him do it. Boots loud on the stone in a silence so complete that Eleanor could hear the fire settling in the small grate near the vestry door. Lady Ashworth's face going pale in the second pew, Camilla Redcliffe's hand tightening on her prayer book, Reginald half rising as though to intervene, and finding in the Earl's face as he passed nothing that invited interference. Somewhere behind her, a child whispered a question, and was hushed. Reverend Whitcomb, still standing at the lectern with her father's name barely settled in the air above the congregation, made no move to reclaim the room, as though he understood before anyone troubled to tell him that this, too, was a kind of thanksgiving the harvest service had been waiting for. He stopped before Eleanor, close enough that the whole church could hear what he said, and far enough, still, that he had touched nothing, asked nothing, claimed nothing she had not first been given the chance to refuse. "I am told the county calls you my mistress," he said, and his voice did not shake, though something beneath it plainly did. "It is not true, and it has never been true, and I have let it stand unanswered a great deal longer than I ought." The church held its breath the way a church holds its breath, entire and silent, and Eleanor felt every eye in the building settle on her face, and found she did not, for once, mind the weight of being seen. "She is not my mistress," the Earl said. "She is to be my wife, if she will still consent to have me." Lady Ashworth's fan stilled in her hand. Camilla looked, for one unguarded moment, more relieved than wounded. Reginald sat down without seeming to decide to, and Eleanor, who had spent 6 weeks learning exactly how little the world's opinion of her had ever had to do with the truth, found she had no ready answer prepared for the one voice in that church whose opinion she had, without quite admitting it to herself, come to care for above every other. "You are not strong enough to have ridden here," she said, because it was the only true thing that arrived first, and because it made him laugh, low and startled and entirely unguarded, in a way she suspected the county had not heard from him in 3 years. "No," he agreed. "I am not. Say yes regardless, Eleanor, and I will let you scold me for it at leisure for the rest of our lives." She said yes. The church, released at last from its held breath, made a sound that was very nearly a cheer, tempered only by the solemnity of the occasion it had interrupted, and Reverend Whitcomb, recovering his composure with visible effort, observed to the assembled parish that he did not believe the harvest service had ever before concluded with quite so much cause for thanksgiving, which was, Eleanor thought, watching Julian's hand find hers at last in front of the whole congregation. Very nearly an understatement. Lady Ashworth left Hollowmere for her sister's house in Bath within the fortnight. Her authority over the estate's small society ended as decisively as it had ever been exercised, and though she wrote, in time, a stiff letter of grudging good wishes that Eleanor chose to answer with more grace than it had been offered, she did not return to Devon while Eleanor kept the house. Reginald's claim to the estate, thin at the best of times, dissolved entirely the following spring, when Julian and Eleanor's first child was born, healthy and loud in the same bedroom where his mother had once, in fever, spoken a name that was not his wife's yet, and would, within the year, become it. The Mourning room at Hollowmere, closed for 3 years, was opened again before the wedding, aired and warmed and set to rights, and it was Eleanor herself who found the embroidery hoop still standing in its frame by the window, Margaret Ashworth's last unfinished stitch caught forever mid-motion in the linen. She did not remove it. She set it instead on the small table by the hearth, where the morning light could still find it. And beside it she placed her father's old prayer book, worn soft at the 90th Psalm from all the evenings she had read it to a sickbed, and some evenings, when the fire was low and Julian's hand found hers across the arm of the settee, without either of them troubling to remark on it, she thought that a house could hold more than one grief and more than one grace at once, and be the better for holding both. Mrs. Hartley stayed on at Hollowmere as its housekeeper still, and it was Mrs. Hartley who taught the new countess, gently and without ever quite naming what she was doing, the particular art of running a great house from its kitchen passage outward rather than its drawing-room in, which Eleanor found she already half knew, having learned its cousin trade at her father's elbow long before she had any reason to expect she would need it here. By the following Christmas, the first snow of the season found the morning room windows warm with firelight from within, and a girl who had once crossed a market square in borrowed silence, certain the world had already decided what it thought of her, sat with her husband's head bent close over a cradle that had been, 3 years before, only an unfinished stitch, and an empty room no one had dared to enter. Thank you for staying with Eleanor's story until its end. If her quiet patience moved you, I hope you will carry a little of it with you tonight.